have the first of two afternoon panels kicking off now. The first panel features Dr. K.P. Krishnan, former Secretary, Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, Government of India. We also have Nat Malupillai, Director of MSDF, Tushar Thakkar, Specialist Investing for Development at Dahlberg Advisors, Samir Shah, Executive Vice Chair and Group President of Dwara Trust, Northern Art, and Sharon Bhutto, Executive Director of IFMR Lead. This panel will be moderated by Mekin Maheshwari, co-founder of GAME. Mekin, over to you.
Thank you everyone for taking your time to join us for this afternoon panel. Madan's already done the introductions. I know all of us have a depth of work in this area of working with small business entrepreneurs. But given the current challenge, I would want us to jump right into thinking about or sharing our views on the context. What are your inputs on what have you experienced both personally and organizationally? So quick reactions to where your organizations are and you are in terms of the crisis that we are going through, and how do you feel it is impacting the small business entrepreneurs? So let's go around the table and do that context setting before we jump into further actions of what could be done in this situation. Samir, could I invite you to start?
Thank you very much. So let me just start by giving a sense for what we are seeing in the early, early days of COVID-19. So at Dwara, I represent a bunch of companies that are all devoted and dedicated to financial inclusion, which is giving access to finance to low-income households. So we have directly and indirectly sort of serve about 25 million households in the country. And one of the early impacts that we've had or we are seeing on the ground is that Reserve Bank of India sometime back announced a moratorium for debt for credit. And there were certain nuances about that moratorium. Firstly, it was discretionary. It was permitted by the lending institutions, but not mandatory. And certain banks took the view that NBFCs and microfinance institutions wouldn't be beneficiaries of that moratorium, which has put not just those MFIs and NBFCs in a bit of a quandary, but their millions and millions of customers that they serve, which are all basically low-income households in the country. Because unless they receive back-to-back moratorium, they in turn can't offer moratorium to their households. And that's sort of, in my view, a nice lens, because they are the neediest of the needy in the country, in a way, sort of people at the last mile, people the most vulnerable, most fragile, whose incomes have gone shattered, because a bulk of them are daily wage earners. So incomes have been really dislocated right now. Geography-wise, they are dislocated. Some of them are stranded, as migrant workers returning back home. Livelihood significantly impacted, really stretching baseline resources to survive. And they are the ones who really need the moratorium more than anyone else. So we are seeing, while the country as a whole is doing a fantastic job locking down, focusing on lives, I think an equal and important focus needs to be on protecting livelihoods, which is, I guess, the focus of this panel. So our immediate lens has been really this, is how do we get the moratorium across to the neediest of the needy sections of society.
Tushar, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thanks, Mekin. Yeah, and I think what I'm about to say resonates quite well with what Samir just said. But just to provide a quick backdrop, Dahlberg, as you're aware, is a strategy consulting firm. What we are hearing is both from our work on the ground as well as what we're hearing from our clients or partners that we are working with at this point of time. My focus is more on the investing side, so I'll probably focus there. But I would say broadly, what we're hearing is that there is, the stress is quite evident. That there seems to be a very significant stress, especially as we now begin heading into month 2 of this lockdown. From whatever we are gathering, and these are some early sort of views and data that we're looking at, that if you think about the amount of cash flow Potentially, a month was maybe fine, but the second month that stretches the MSMEs quite a bit. What that also seems to indicate, for me at least, is that this is being seen more as a liquidity crisis at a macro level rather than being more of a fundamental issue. While of course, we will see the effects of demand drop and then how households respond to this and how industries respond to this subsequently, but there seems to be a substantial need to fill the liquidity gap at this point of time. I would say that is observation number one. The second thing that we are seeing is that there is a response, and responses are being put together by a wide variety of actors. At this point of time, the most sort of coherent response is of, if you think about investors, for example, is to focus on things or the enterprises that they know best, which would be their investees or the ones which are within their network. Cross player collaboration, I would say, is slightly at a slightly earlier stage. Though as Game is trying to do, or as other players have been trying to do, there are a number of players trying to put together some of these interventions, because that then can support some of the broader things that the government is trying to do.
KP sir, could I invite you for your starting positions, your viewpoints on where are we in dealing with this crisis and who's most impacted?
I am more or less on in agreement with what Tushar said. I haven't gone out or actually connected with people on the ground. We knew all along that the MSME sector, and in particular the informal sector, has a whole bunch of limitations when it comes to the ability of the formal mechanism to reach them. And that's clearly getting highlighted. And I think that came out also in the point that Samir made. And half of India's financial system says, we don't know it's applicable to us. Is it applicable to somebody else? And I'm sort of somewhat on the same lines as what Ashok Gulati has said in the Indian Express today, talking in a related but slightly different context, namely agricultural marketing. We have felt all along that a system originally intended to protect the farmer, namely the APMC system, for at least last 15, 20 years we knew was actually being inimical. It was hurting the interests of farmers, but we were collectively not being able to do anything. Whether we tried, whether there were forces against it, I leave that aside. Net, we were not able to do anything about it. So the call that he gives in his column today is, in a number of these areas, I think we know that there are some fundamental challenges. And I think using the COVID opportunity, we should attack some of these, because these opportunities don't come. And I think our ability to reach the informal sector in a meaningful way has to be attacked from the foundations. I think there are problems that are known, there are solutions that are known. Can we list them out quickly, get regulators, get policy persons to come together and sort them out? That's my sort of initial opening remarks.
Nat, could I invite you to share your opening position?
Lovely to meet everybody. So again, broad alignment with everything that's been said so far. We always know about the struggle of the MSMEs well before the COVID crisis hit. I think all of us are working on, how do we help catalyze the segment and, make this even more meaningful segment in terms of India's GDP and all that. And we know there is significant opportunity there. But I think COVID really brings out, the fault lines in the system, if you will, right? I mean, so, how fragmented it is and how lack of a support that they have, all that is, very badly felt as we think about MSMEs in our own vantage point. So we have quite a few of portfolio companies, who are MSME lenders, and we look at the MSMEs ecosystem through that lens. So it's a struggle. So there is no collections happening in late March, and then entire April, May, June is what you're suggesting. So no disbursements happening as well. So from a very very talking abstract into really getting into the trenches, people are not ready to lend. I mean, they just don't have a system wherein that money could do anything for them, right? So, if we think of demonetization being bad, this is, put your multiplier on 10x, 25x worse, because you can't do group meetings if you're a microfinance company, right? The very essence of how you go about your business has gone away, and you don't know when that's going to come back. And there is no alternate setup. I mean, a lot of these people are still not digital, in terms of being able to dispose or collect. But forget the channel, but what will they do even if you disburse, right? And they can't do anything about it. So there are really deep-rooted ills that COVID has brought out, and that's caught me, that's what we're seeing. So it's definitely liquidity for sure, right? But the day is not far off when this becomes a solvency issue as well, right? And as this continues on, some of the ability, standing power, and some of the supply chain, all of that is getting affected. We see the, I'm sure when you look at a TREDS platform, the invoice discounting is probably, is on its knees. The anchor-led investing is affected. So any which way you look at it, I think there is huge, problems that we are seeing. And I think as I look into the, what comes next, retail and trade will probably come up much sooner than others. If we look at the maids and drivers who service a typical salaried person, they'll probably snap back into working and income much sooner, is what we're seeing. But some that involves multiple layers of supply chain, manufacturing, is going to take a long time to get its act in order, and we don't know when that is. So that's my view of the problem statement. And in terms of very high level as to how we are thinking about it, at this point in time, we are still thinking sustenance. We really don't know what repair looks like, right? At this point in time, it's relief or rescue, because we don't know where the bottom is. I mean, till we talk about things like till we know there's a cure, till we know there's a vaccine, till we know businesses can now come out and start doing things that they're supposed to do. Everything that we put in is going to be how do we keep them on the survival path. And obviously, all of us are short on resources. We can't make everybody survive, talking business. So there are calls that we are making saying, which businesses do we let die? These are things that were always iffy, and do we pull the plug right now? I mean, these are the kind of calls that all of us are making right now. So that's kind of how, over the next few months, as the lockdown situation clears up, is when we can really talk about cash flow and what does it take to bring this business back to life and all that. So right now we are just having the discussions, but none of us are sure how grounded those are. I mean, these are really, really high level estimates, which gets revised on a weekly basis. So with that, I'm going to stop the first part of the comment, and we'll come back and talk more.
Sharon, for you to bring us up to some ground level information and understanding from the person who's possibly most connected on the ground of this panel, could you share what your perspectives are on how bad this situation is currently and what is the impact?
I think it's, I'll try to complement what everybody said. I think, so the past weeks has been quite an interesting deep dive in understanding the repercussions on the many projects we have on the ground across the states. Like you mentioned, we have projects across many dimensions. And I think this type of crisis really brings in how things are connected together, in a sense that when we say things work in an ecosystem, I think we never really realize how quickly, how depth, or how wide the ecosystem was important to the survival of the small businesses, actually. Some are deeply affected, some are less, but then you have all these other sort of like repercussions that we're seeing, and we're trying to sort of like connect it all together. And I think because at least LEAD, we have like a wide range of topics on the ground, we do look at migration. We do look at the impacts of gender-based violence. We do look at the impacts of, for example, women's employment, which was already low. And while those things are not immediate for the crisis, it'll take back India, the efforts on that part will also, be, the past 5-6 years will be erased, the efforts on that point. So there's a lot of concern with trying to build that up alongside with, the MSME ecosystem. What I've seen on the ground as well is that one thing you could notice is the ability for some to really innovate and adapt in terms of resilience. Because I've seen, so there's no doubt that there's a double whammy in a sense, because India was already facing a demand crisis even before the COVID. Now you imagine you have a supply and demand together. And I think, like Nat was saying, for the people who have a supply crisis, we have no clue how that will recover. If you're in a service, you can do it right away. If you're part of a supply chain, you have no understanding. The demand side is something where people are trying already to figure out how to create other demands. So I've already seen many of our work in artisan clusters who shifted to making masks and trying to figure out how they can be useful in sort of like rural contexts. So for example, we have a lot of projects in rural Chhattisgarh and the tribal areas, and we do work on government delivery mechanism. So already people are trying to figure out a mechanism where people, small businesses or enterprise or agriculture, through technology that they have created that we're piloting on the ground, they see as an opportunity to really, encourage the government to say, why don't we try this? There's no harm because there is a lot of urgent things that need to be done on the ground. Having said that, we see a lot of despair in a sense. Like some of the people actually are not sure as well, how to recover. We've been looking at data from China. So China, not the health data, but there are some think tanks that have already been, and I don't know if you're aware of some of the work. Sometimes in February, one think tank had done a study where I think they're in a similar situation where we're now, where I think businesses were not sure at all able to recover, probably 40% were not sure. And recently, end of March, I think CAFE, one of the financial inclusion organization, recently shared some results where they're saying it's not as bad, but it's different. So the extent to how people will suffer, and I think that also reflects similar, India is very heterogeneous. So any recovery will be so contextual and depending on many, many factors. I do see, and I think Nat was mentioning, some people won't survive this, but that also is probably because that's sort of like they're already on a shaky foundation. And maybe, they're able to recover to something else. Some people will innovate and adapt on it. And I think what we know for sure is that any measure, we have to wait how the government will respond and react to that. I think a lot of people are in a waiting mode. A lot of the conversations I have with many organizations are waiting for when packages will come from the government, how the banks will relax their requirements, because I think there's a fear that if banks do as usual, say they don't change their norms, or if there's no changes on bankruptcy rules and things like that, and if it's just like that, then there's a problem like that. There's agility and flexibility in terms of adapting to that. I think people see a way out of it. Those are the things we're observing on the ground. Yeah. And personally, actually, you had mentioned Mezakin, I'm actually waiting for my visa approval, which is stuck at the FRO because the government is not working. So that's just my
Thank you, Sharon, and I hope the visa comes soon.
Yeah, me too.
We need you here. I think the breadth of challenges is hard to cover in this conversation, and I'd want us to take a constructivist view to figure out where do we head from. There were two threads that KP sir brought up and Samir brought up that maybe we can start with those, which are this piece about, like, there are foundational changes. There are foundations which we've known the problem. We know we want to fix it. We have solutions in mind, but we haven't necessarily been able to implement them. Can we use the COVID opportunity to actually bring those solutions to the fore and make them happen? What might some of those be? And specifically, this divide between the formal and the informal, where like our central bank is issuing things which possibly work for the formal economy, but what does it even mean for the informal economy? And for us to not have a blind eye towards our informal economy because it's massive. So if we could maybe center the first part of the conversation on this, and then later switch over to talking about what is it, what might be specific instruments in which we could actually make these changes happen and impact liquidity on ground. So the urgency that is needed, what might be things that could be done to aid or to ensure that we are working with the same urgency that the virus is, or ideally faster than that. So with that, and now we went round the table. We don't necessarily have to follow structure anymore. Please feel free to jump in. I'd like to start with either of Samir or KP sir to help us go deeper in what might be foundational changes for which the COVID opportunity is the right opportunity to ensure that our financing systems get significantly better than they have been.
We should have learned this by now, because we saw that fracture during demonetization. We saw it significantly exposed at that point in time. And then we sort of doubled down on digital money. And then once again, we are significantly exposed that we over bet on digital money and not so much on cash in, cash out points. So, one of the biggest issues that we are seeing right now is the abundance and the availability of cash in, cash out points to serve the informal sector communities. Although I think the government was very prompt in classifying business, banking correspondence, business correspondence as essential services, it's just not sufficient. That number of cash in, cash out points is minuscule to the sort of as compared to the needs of this people. So one of the things we need to do is we need to change, and payment banks are working very hard from what I know. I'm talking to them quite regularly, but even they have been caught by surprise in terms of lack of preparedness in terms of cash in, cash out points. So I think the need of the hour is to enable millions and millions of cash in, cash out points. Figure out the traditional definitions of who could be a cash in, cash out point. Today there is enough infrastructure that's available, and the urgency of getting cash to the last mile, which is sort of a cliched statement we keep making every time, cash for the last mile, is something that we've been talking for years. I think this is the time to repair that fracture, is to move away from traditional definitions of who can be a cash in, cash out point. Today, fintechs have enabled merchants, but that's all on paper. Is a merchant ready today with cash? And are those linkages with a nearby link branch which actually has cash, so that they can actually dispense cash to a low-income household or to an informal sector worker who walks to a merchant and tries to withdraw cash? Because as cash transfers are hitting people's bank accounts, the whole Jan Dhan account is also getting exposed. With a rapid momentum, we enabled Jan Dhan accounts for millions and millions of Indians, but those were limited purpose accounts. They have limited withdrawals programmed into the design of that account, and there are multiple challenges. So I think that the whole cash in, cash out and money for the last mile, cash for the last mile, is I think some of the biggest number one challenge while we fight the virus and health issues needs to be sort of taken head on.
We have again to sort of come to specifically the question that you asked in continuation of what I said earlier. Large numbers of these enterprises, the informal, nano, micro, small, whatever you choose to call them, are not, they are not appropriate candidates for the standard form of institutional financing, which is balance sheet and asset-based financing. Clearly, these are all either individuals or, if you choose to call them enterprises, who are more likely to be income flow based financing model, more likely pure consumption type loan if you were to stick to our original standard classification. Now, the large bank PSU led or private sector bank led model is expensive as a mechanism of delivery for these guys. Now, from the mid 70s, we've tried number of experiments. We tried those Grameen banks, and we learned very valuable lessons from there. And I think we saw some significant improvement in the sector when the first round of private sector MFIs began to start financing. Now, whatever happened in the last round, Andhra Pradesh ordinance, etc., we've again learned lessons. There are a whole bunch of entities, NBFCs, MFIs, all kinds of entities, which now have good connections with a large number of these enterprises, and enabling them to be part of the institutional refinancing is, I think, one very quick step that the regulator and the policymakers can do. I think what we can do collectively, a bunch of us on this program and others, we know, I think between us and in our community, the over 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 type entities, which are now reasonably proven in their ability to do what Samir called, in a different context though, the last mile financing. Guys who can actually get 10,000, 20,000, 1 lakh type working capital, as well as support loans to people. I think all of them need to be brought into a formal institutional refinancing model, because we currently don't have a method of financing them. So this could be, in addition to what Samir said, one step at marrying our fundamental longer term agenda as well as solving the current problem.
I'd love to invite all the other panelists to share their thoughts about this specific area, which is including the last mile. So enabling those who enable cash at the last mile. What are your thoughts? What might be steps that could be taken urgently so that we can make this happen in time?
So there are some very interesting innovations that's been happening, although not in the scale or numbers that we ever wanted. I think there are several incubators, India stack-based solutions, and so on and so forth, which have tried to bring in digital to flatten some of those information asymmetry and get them on an even keel. So I think one is doing more and more of that is going to be important. This is as good a disruption as any to get more people to get on board that. And the second thing I would say is this whole Aadhaar equivalent for MSMEs. And again, we'll have to figure out the right time. I think after the sustenance is taken care and once we make sure they survive and all that. But I think the challenge is it's easier to address the formal MSMEs through RBI intervention or MSME ministry intervention versus others. And how do we use the opportunity to get more and more to the formal economy? I think that's something that I keep thinking about. Is this an opportunity to do that? Without having them go through suffering anymore, without making it too bureaucratic to do it the single window and all that. So we'll have to figure out how we do it. But this is a very good opportunity to bring them into a so-called formal fold where we have visibility to them. Where are they? Are they viable? And how do we do that? On the same token, I would say, other than central or union, how do we localize some of these things, right? I mean, even the funding and dispersal of these things, how could you do it at a more local level through some of the clusters that are there or some of the state chapters of MSME, getting them involved a bit more so that you can actually tease out which are the viable opportunities that we want to go and help early on, as opposed to trying and being too democratic about it, and then in the end everybody suffers. So I think those are, some random thoughts as to how to go about streamlining them and bringing them into the formal process. Demon was a great opportunity to become digital, although we've since then gone back and a bit more cash and all that. But I do think there's a fantastic opportunity to do certain things that have started, including the cash flow based assessments that KP sir talked about. Getting more of their businesses through bank statements, more point of sale terminals being a form of assessing how formal these businesses are. I think there are some really good opportunities that are out there that businesses are tapping into. How do you flow that to some of the smaller ones and giving them the opportunity to gain from the formal visibility that they have into the system? I think that's something that I see more and more happening. But I think this would be a great opportunity to penetrate even deeper, to get them to be formal. And again, I know the question also was, how do you support them while still being informal? And I think we have enough of those NBFCs, and I know Dwara does enough of those KGFS type models and so on. I think an India Post would be another behemoth organization that we tap into. How do we actually tap into the organization to be the last mile, talking about cash and cash out, payment back type functionality? How do you make them quickly adapt to the war that's happening, and build the capabilities as part of these organizations to go meet the customer where they need to be met, rather than the other way around. So those are some top thoughts that come to me to add to what Samir and KP said.
I would love to actually leave my post as convener and become a panelist, but maybe I'll first look at Sharon to respond to the suggestion around formalization, right? Or using the COVID opportunity to help or to enable the formalization of a large number of the enterprises that exist in the country.
I think I fully agree with Nat. I think problematization in this sector has been done since I've been in India the past 10 years. The problems are still there. Solutioning has advanced. There are quite a lot of innovative solutions. I think what's missing is the convincing action on the side of the formal institutions. While some are ready to experiment, I do not see as much flexibility as should be. I think there's still stringent requirements, and I've tried personally myself and with my team and do a lot of work even in terms of understanding credit scoring, delivery mechanism. We're working with the Rural Transformation Project of World Bank on trying to figure out how to minimize the time to, this was even before pre-COVID. We estimated that it will take, the quickest we can deliver funds would be 40 days because of all the mechanism I have to go through, despite having so much research that said that we don't need this step. So I think it's for the formalization to a little bit be less stringent. And I'm sure there's requirement, because I know, for example, private banks have particular targets. But I would think that maybe this could be an opportunity to relax some of these things and actually test. We're talking about, testing drugs and COVID, what will work or not. We should have many trials such as this, things like, reviving things that we've been talking for a long time. Why don't we try this? And if it works, it works. The important thing is to iterate quickly and understand quickly, because now it's a time to test and experiment and figure out how can we quickly help people. I think that would be my stake on this. Yeah.
Tushar, inviting you in on this conversation about what might be changes that we could drive in our foundational formal structures, or in trying to drive formalization in amongst the MSMEs.
Yeah, no, and actually Sharon set it up beautifully, the point that I had in mind. I think we spoke about touch points that we have with informal organizations before, and we spoke about innovations that potentially could be tried out, treating this more as an opportunity. I think there is an opportunity here to understand those touch points better, and then trying to find specific points of intervention. For example, an opportunity to say that a lot of informal enterprises might be part of either the forward or the backward looking supply or distribution chains for large formal enterprises. Is there an opportunity here? Because for those formal enterprises, which a lot of them might be highly credit worthy, is there an opportunity there to figure out how that credit worthiness could stretch in either direction a little bit more? It already stretches quite a bit to their larger formal suppliers sometimes, and then also formal distributors, but can it stretch to informal enterprises as well? Similarly, thinking about where those other touch points might be, what can be innovative ways of actually going through those to reach informal enterprises? And I think this is more of I would say, a medium-term solution in some ways, because there may need to be a little bit more work to be done to figure out which are those touch points which are creditworthy, are fundable, and therefore can be used to actually pass on some of these benefits. But I think what that can do is lead to what Nat spoke about before, which is be able to generate enough data and information about these informal enterprises who start becoming part of the net of financial sort of inclusion, to then mainstream a lot of what is going on through these innovative means. So I think there is innovation at the instrument level takes some time. Innovation at and some of the other innovations that we spoke about, which are more regulatory, etc. in nature, might be potentially slightly faster because there are decision makers who could respond to that. But looking within the existing system to find those touch points through which existing banking systems, existing financial systems can reach these informal enterprises could potentially be a creative way of doing this. Just some sort of early thoughts around that.
So, like the startup entrepreneur in me is bubbling up in terms of hearing words like innovation, flexibility, test and experiment, and rapid iteration. It's just that you're demanding that of our financial systems, and I think that itself is a large area of challenge. I do want to leave one thought before we quickly move, which is one of the challenge with formalization that we've experienced working directly with informal entrepreneurs has been the lack of trust in them. So because the system doesn't necessarily approach them from a point of trust, and on the ground, the last mile targets them like with all its forces, with all its guns. That makes it really, really hard for an informal entrepreneur to trust that formalization may be a path that will lead them forward. But I feel this piece about how could innovations thrive and what are some of the challenges is fairly deep rooted, and we can only touch the surface of it. We have a current and large problem at hand, right? And Tushar brought it up initially in terms of liquidity, right? Ensuring that people have cash in hand. It's how will people survive? We don't even know how long this might last. Sharon brought in some instances from China, but I don't think we've acted, at least at the micro level, with Chinese efficiency and discipline. So how long might this stretch? We are in our month 2, and how long might this stretch, and what would that mean? So from an urgency point of view, which is today, what should be some of the actions that we must be driving towards? GAME has just about kicked off a small $100 million business stabilization fund, and we're trying to figure out how can we get that funded. But I think it's a drop in the ocean. Right? India is a huge ocean, and the challenge we are faced with is massive. So I want to bring the panel's attention to the now, and suggest ways in which we can move forward, which we can galvanize a lot more people to move forward, to start attacking this problem from various angles, which is the current liquidity and sustenance challenge that most of the SMEs are facing today and will face.
I think it's the answer. I mean, this is a very, very difficult question, Mekin, right? I mean, I think all of us are struggling to see how we begin putting together different pieces of the puzzle. And I think that's sometimes is a bad thing, as in it stops you from acting right now because of how huge a problem it is. But I think there are some very interesting efforts that are coming together. I mean, GAME's own $100 million stabilization fund and a few others like that. And I think one of the approaches that we are taking is go where you're more comfortable, in the sense you already have portfolio companies, you already have access to enough NBFC lenders and fintechs who support MSMEs and gig economy workers and blue collar, gray collar workers. So I think quantifying the problem as you already know it and going and taking care of them, because these are people that you already know about. There is data about them. There is already you know how much of credit exposure they have, what kind of businesses they run, at least till Feb or March 2020 before COVID impact happened. So there's no reason to pause on those efforts. And these are people suffering and they're going under really quickly. So one is to open up your liquidity tap to them and help them survive, while you take a broader read of the system and how are they responding. And we really don't know the magnitude of this. I think that's the reality of it. But that should not stop us from taking those deliberate 1-2 steps towards solving the problem through the lens that we are most comfortable. I mean, some of us could be certain kind of a sector, some of them could be agri, some urban. I think that's the the message that I'm hearing as well, that everybody is going where they are most comfortable, and then together there is enough momentum in the system. That's one. And the government, I think we all are still looking to the government and RBI to do a lot more, because the size of the problem is indeed too big. And I think everything that we put out together quickly gets absorbed. And some of this requires almost a universal basic income type of an intervention for a short term, for us to get to a point where we are neutral and then revive the businesses, right? So I think those are, certain things that I see businesses doing. We are doing, rather than on lending, we are doing guarantees wherein our funds can have a lot more leverage, right? How could we take the businesses that we feel most confident of, our portfolios, geographies, clusters, whatever it is, and do more and more guarantees that will then help the lenders open up a lot more, and that has multiplier effect on it. So those are some very tactical here and now steps that you're doing while we're still figuring out the broader, how do we solve the problem as a team together.
So I'll pick up the sort of thread from that and just talk about a quick response potentially. And it's great that GAME is putting together a 100 million stabilization fund. I think the need of the hour, and it's becoming quite obvious, the fact that GAME are putting together this panel, and the title of the panel is a coalition. And I think I want to go back to the heart of what this coalition could be, which is a marriage between sort of the social capital and commercial capital. And traditionally, these have all gone in different directions. The commercial capital has got a certain characteristic, certain color, certain return expectations, and social capital has got certain other characteristics. This is the perfect opportunity to bring it all together and create leverage, and then thereby reach out to millions and millions of needy households. So I think it is about putting our heads together and saying, how can there be solutions that can be designed where social capital merges and sits as, to use a technical term, you become a subordinate lender, and then commercial capital becomes a senior lender, and then thereby 100 million fund can become a 1 billion corpus, and that's a different game altogether. That's a different impact altogether. You're already talking 10x, and that's just 100 million that you guys are putting together. I know by talking to others that there are several of these 10, 50, 100 million ideas that are popping up. If each one of those could be 10x, we are suddenly talking of 50 billion sort of corpus, and we're not even talking of state intervention here. So I think the merger, sort of coming together of social capital, commercial capital around solution design, and rapid deployment to the end user or the consumers would be, I think, a great starting point. And I think that's, you sort of hint at that through the title of this panel anyway.
And I think just to sort of carry on a little bit from there, I think what is critical is to figure out what are the kinds of partnerships which can be made between the capital which is being mobilized and the existing financial systems from a couple of angles. One, setting up a new system obviously isn't possible at this point of time to reach the individuals who really need this cash. But also being able to use existing risk management systems, existing processes, etc., is quite critical, and because that has a significant implication on the speed by which this can be done. That would be number one. Number two, in my mind, is also this recognition that we are all trying to essentially fill gaps which are left behind because there are a bunch of other interventions going on, and therefore just a slightly more deliberate approach of figuring out what's going on, talking to others, and knowing where will our capital have the most impact, rather than getting to a stage where there's actually competition between capital. And I think that in my view is fairly critical. We spoke initially also about coordination between players, and therefore being able to understand what are the gaps that we are trying to meet. I completely agree and understand that the need is massive, and therefore often there'll be situations where any capital being added in a particular area is incremental. But still, I would say really important to understand what are the gaps we are trying to meet, especially because the social and commercial capital comes together, which does provide a lot of flexibility, leverage, risk-taking capability, etc. And just on the first point again, the other driver of wanting to go through existing systems is that the financial system itself will probably need some support at some point of time. I know the government is trying to do their bit in this, but if the financial system is brought within the fold and therefore is actually the channel through which a lot of these interventions are flowing, I think it would help the financial system as well, given that they have also there's been substantial stress for a number of players even prior to the COVID crisis. So I think a coordinated approach, I think, would really help, because otherwise we would have other challenges or other fires that we'll need to keep putting down as we go forward. So those were some of the thoughts about how we could.
So the macro sense I get speaking to my colleagues in government is that there will perhaps be something on the lines of what Nat said, namely there will be a Government of India effort with the help of external funding agencies like the World Bank and the ADB to put together a fairly large MSME stabilization fund of an institutional kind, which will be managed by one of the known sort of standard public sector type vehicles. Typically, Government of India will get this part right. I think what is going to be difficult thereafter is to ensure that down the line, because the Government of India's role here actually will be very limited. It brings in the money, it probably puts in some very large frameworks, but bringing in all those partners, one of the speakers mentioned the small scale industries development corporations. In some states, they are still reasonably well functioning and efficient, and they have some good connections on the ground. In many states, they are not. So we need completely alternate mechanisms. Some states, the state or the district lead banks have done a decent job, but in a majority of districts, they haven't. So I think pan-India, it would be useful to put in place the exact phrase that somebody used, this marriage of social capital and institutional or official capital. The channels for this to play through to the last mile is identification of a series of partners and players at the state level, at the regional level, at the block level, because we will certainly be able to reach people in Delhi, Mumbai, but there are people far, far beyond. And I think reaching them will require this huge mapping exercise. And there are lots of institutions that are actually doing this. I think just getting a handle on who's doing what, and B, parallelly, also getting ready to provide the non-finance business development type support that is required, because that will need to go hand in hand with the finance for a large number of these enterprises. I think, again, collectively, a forum like this is particularly well suited to bridge this gap. That will be my additional point.
I think people already said it brilliantly. I think this is a great opportunity because we're talking about the informal sector, and I think as well, the informal sector uses brilliantly social capital. In fact, they thrive on that. And in terms of trying to find more formal mechanism, I think if the formal sector takes an opportunity to understand how to integrate social capital well, then that would be a great effort to bring people in the formal sector. We've tried many experiments on our side to integrate aspects of more social capital when you look at lending institutions, formal banks, and they're always very hesitant. And some of them are very similar to what people in rural networks utilize, like chit funds or money lenders or pawnbrokers. But somehow a lot of the formal lending institutions are very hesitant to even use a combination of that. But I think if you're going to formalize people and make sure, we can give them access to formal, decent terms finance, we can take this opportunity to integrate a little bit more. And that goes about this experimentation that we're talking about or not mentioned. Like, do credit scores always have to be only about turnover and sales? Can they not utilize people's electricity bill, confidence of the entrepreneur in the sector? Because I've seen a lot of people in the rural areas, and one of my first projects in India 10 years back was studying in depth the registered chit fund industry, which everybody frowns upon, but they have a brilliant mechanism by which they know the community extremely well, actually. And they have an integrated package where you have people save. You also, the chit fund manager knows exactly who's having kids, when the education of a girl or a boy will happen, they will tell in advance when a person needs a car. They go and they sort of like train people, hey, this is a good time. And so those are mechanisms that it's hard to replace when you don't have presence, or even if a formal financial institution is not willing to have that closeness with the community. And we have tried sort of like, and even I have worked with chit fund agencies to see whether they can integrate this in some formal credit scoring mechanism. And it's been a challenge. So hopefully, this crisis will help bridge both and arrive at the best outcome possible for that. Yeah.
One point I would love to add to this, I think it's, sometimes when people have brilliant ideas, it's so much easy to piggyback on it. When all this is done, I think the demand for credit will, be humongous, right? I mean, everybody wants it. And from a lot of lenders that we speak to are also thinking about how will they tweak their policies now, right? I mean, so you can't go back to the same credit policy parameters that you had 3 months back. You can't demand like the average number of transactions for the last 6 months, 9 months. That's not going to work. You're not going to have the same FOIR ratio. Different things will be different. So I'm, you should be cognizant of that. So how quickly can you change things around to work in the so-called new normal? I think that's going to be important. I also worry about, this whole idea of MSME credit and access is one of momentum, right? You constantly try and test certain segments or deciles and then go after the riskier decile. And I think with this disruption, this whole test and learn and experiment also, I worry will come to a bit of a pause until they figure out and so on. And this is where social capital or philanthropy capital should play a leadership role in terms of being steadfast in providing access to that segment, right? In terms of picking where you left off, in terms of, these are sustainable businesses still 3 months back. How do we look at that and be innovative in terms of credit algorithms as well? So I think that's something something that's important that we don't lose sight of.
I feel like we just got started and do think that there is a lot more to carry on, but in the interest of time and in the interest of your time, I would like to thank all of you for such a engaged and thoughtful discussion. I do want to take on and open up the possibility of us engaging on at least these 2 topics, like what can COVID be used as an opportunity for in terms of helping the formal system and the foundations of what kind of economy do we build. If there are thoughts or changes there, and if some of you could pour in to me and Ashwin, we can try and see how we could at least get a coalition going around it. Right? And the second idea of this drop in the ocean becoming a trickle and a stream, and eventually being able to enable a large part of the economy survive this large challenge. So any further thoughts or ideas on these, or point us to good people, point us to research that you may be aware of, or just let's get on a call one-on-one to discuss some of these. I'm hungry for more. Thank you so much for the time, and thank you for sparking a lot of interesting thoughts in me, and I'm sure in others, which I noticed during the conversation. Thank you all for your time.